Godrej, chairman of the Ananta Center and the co-chair of the India-U.S. Cooperation on Climate Change and Energy. It's a track 2 dialogue on climate change and energy, and my co-chair is Carol Browner, who's a distinguished senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and she has also been at the White House recently and in charge of this subject, as well as the administrator of the Environment Protection Agency. And the other panelists that we have with us today, we have Mary Nichols. Mary Nichols is the chairman of the California Air Resources Board, and Arun Majumdar is, he was till recently in the government handling technology issues, but he's now at Stanford University. He's the J. Precourt professor and senior fellow at the Precourt Institute of Energy at Stanford University. We have Sunita Narayan, who's the Director General for the Center for Science and Environment. And we have with us Harish Hande, who's the co-founder and chairman of CELCO, which is a distributed renewable energy organization. I want to just say in the beginning that we've had extremely useful dialogue these last 2 days. This is a series of dialogues which we've been having over the last 3 years. And this track 2 dialogue has greatly helped to build understanding and in a very important issue of climate change and energy. And many of the topics that we discussed include technology issues. They include issues to do with energy access and innovation, to do with resilience, to do with air pollution and health issues. And so these are issues which we recognize, especially in India, that they are of crucial importance to us. And so what I would like to do is to request each of the panelists to first give you in 5 minutes their impression of this dialogue, what they see as the benefit for both of us, as well as their takeaways from it. And I will start first with Carol Browner.
Thank you, Jamshed, and let me applaud your chairmanship of this meeting. It was a very, very good meeting, and we appreciate what you and the entire Indian delegation brought to it. And let me thank my American counterparts for joining in this discussion. This Track 2 dialogue has been now, this is the 5th meeting? A 5th meeting. Some of us joined while it was in process. Others have given their time and expertise from the beginning. And I think, at least from my perspective, each meeting is more productive than the one before, in part because we learn more about the efforts and the undertakings in each country, the work of the individuals who are part of the Track 2 dialogue. I think that there were, as is always the case, a number of very interesting discussions that were a part of this particular meeting. Jamshed mentioned several areas. I thought that we had a particularly important discussion, which was a new agenda item on conventional pollutants, urban design, transportation, and what we hope to do in these Track 2 dialogues as each of the groups return to their respective homes. We will then share with our government officials the nature of these conversations and where we see opportunities for some work together. But it is an honor to be a part of this, and I thank you for hosting us in this particular session.
So next, I'll ask Harish Hande to speak.
Yeah, thanks, Jamshed. I think for me, first thing, I did not understand how to speak in diplomatic language, which is where I learned this in the 5 meetings.
I still haven't learned.
Yeah, so I'm still on your side, Sunita. So from an energy access point, I think if you look at today 2.5 to 3 billion people who really don't have access to energy, reliable energy, I think both countries have a very nice way of working together for that 2.5 to 2, like getting away the boundaries of US and India if you look at four ways of invention, innovation, implementation, and replication, I think this is where the innovation part of many of the institutes in the United States, the invention part, the innovation part using India as a lab, because there are so many issues of energy access. When we have 500 million people approximately with no access to energy, we could be that positive lab of innovation in terms of business processes, business models, financial processes, technology innovations. We could define a problem and implement it. And how can we both work together? Today, a lot of the inventions that are happening is from the want side. It's for the rich class. But we're really not innovating for the poor in the right manner that gives value to the needs that is actually done. Everything is from the consumptive side, nothing is on the asset side. I think that's where both the countries, where India can actually be that center of knowledge, that center of the knowledge for the world, for that 3 billion people, and that I think is the cooperation that both the countries can play for these 3 billion people. And that's what I think this Track 2 meetings is pushing forward, is how do you both cooperate in that level. I think that's the important thing.
Thank you, Harish. I now request Mary to speak. As you know, California has been a leader on the environment and energy side in the US. And we all like to say that if the rest of the US was like California, it would be a wonderful place.
Well, we think so, too. So California has a long history of struggling with air pollution and a much more recent history of addressing the issues of climate change. And I think in the dialogue, I won't speak for my counterpart for Sunita, but I will say that I think we, in general, agree that addressing these two problems actually requires many similar solutions, but that it's possible to leapfrog over some of the things that took us decades to accomplish in California. So we first began addressing the kinds of air pollution that are harmful to human health back in the 1960s, late 60s, early 70s, through a series of progressively more stringent standards relating to vehicles, fuels, electricity generation, and so forth, aiming always at getting closer and closer to an objective, science-based air quality standard that was designed to protect public health. And over the years, we have indeed made huge progress while at the same time growing our economy. And so the lesson that one can do this, that it is possible with a sufficiently strong base in science and technology and the political will to get the policy instruments together to make very substantial changes, I think is one that's useful and illustrative. But it's also true that if we're going to take this to the level of dealing with global pollutants that are similarly resulting from the way we move around, the mobility issues in our cities and the way we transport both people and goods, that this is going to require more than what we can expect to deliver from better engines, better alternative fuels, and so forth, that we really are going to need to also find better ways to either move things or not move them at all, but in any event to deal with the land use and transportation planning side of the equation, which politically was the hardest and was the thing that it took us the longest to begin to deal with. And really now that we are taking climate seriously with the long-term and short-term goals of reducing emissions by 2020 to 1990 levels, we have had to begin to move to look at our transportation systems as a whole and to begin to think in a much more ambitious way about how to get those under control. So I think that's enough for the opening. Yeah.
Thank you, Mary. I'll just mention here that as the representative of industry here, that I think that if you look at what Indian industry has done over the last decade or so, I think that many of the schemes that have been promoted by government, especially on energy efficiency and technology, many of these have moved quite rapidly. Many industry segments, such as cement and other bulk industry segments, have done enormous improvements in energy efficiency over the years. More schemes and more regulation and coming in this area, I think industry is actually quite keen to cooperate now on these issues because they see the benefit of it. And I would just say that I know that there are many leading companies in the US also which have strongly embraced this agenda. And I think that this coalition of industry to work together does greatly benefit everyone on this agenda. I would now like to request Arun to speak.
Well, first of all, let me just, Jamshed, thank you for hosting. And I just want to thank not just Jamshed, but the whole Indian group for the hospitality in hosting us. This is my second meeting in this forum. And it's been I would say, a great educational experience to learn not just the US side, but of course on the Indian side as well. Well, let me just say that if you step back for a moment, we have had this industrial revolution, so to speak, for the last 250 years. And it needs energy. All the economic growth has come from the use of energy. But we do have a global problem on climate. And if you are to follow business as usual, it's not going to be very good for the whole world. So we have a collective responsibility to change that and to give access to electricity to the billions of people who don't have access today. But to do that, you need innovations. You need innovations in technology, you need innovations in finance, you need innovations in business models, in regulation, in the regulatory framework. So it's the alignment of the innovations that are absolutely critical. And my role when I was in the government in the first term of the Obama administration, I had the privilege of leading a new agency called ARPA-E, where we looked at innovations in technology because that is necessary. It's not sufficient, but it's absolutely necessary. And through that, we found that there's a tremendous amount of capacity in the United States to innovate, to bring down the cost, whether it's solar through something called the Sunshot program that we created, or batteries or other energy efficiency measures. But what it has to do, in addition to bringing down cost, is to actually, at the end of the day, all of this is to serve people. And let me just echo what Hari said, that if we cannot serve people, then what's the point in the technology? And so we are here really to understand that context. So how can we bring to bear the best innovations, the leapfrogging in technology, to bring to bear to serve people? And this is really where I've gained a lot from this discussion to understand what the context is out here, and to bring the two together and provide the services and the access to energy so that you have economic growth, but the economic growth is not mutually exclusive to the environment, but rather mutually inclusive with the environment.
Sunita?
Thank you, Jamshed. And I definitely think this dialogue has been very important. I mean, there is no doubt that the Indian position and the US position on climate change has had very deep differences. But the only way to really resolve differences is to learn to talk to each other, understand each other. And this dialogue has been important, and I do think that both the Ananta Center as well as all the people who put it together were very, they did not try and sort of cover up by making sure that only people who had one point of view were represented even from the Indian side. So I think it's been a very rich dialogue over the last 3 years now that we've been meeting, because we come with very different perspectives. We are all very strong in our fields because we have done the work in our own governments, in our own countries, and we have the ability to be able to talk to each other. And I think that itself is the beginning of making substantial change in the way the world will look at climate change. And I think over the last few years, we have had a reasonably better understanding of the differences. We've also come together to be able to make some breakthroughs. For instance, The issue of HFC, this is a pollutant which was introduced because the world phased out CFCs and was introduced as a chemical, but today it is found to have very high climate change potential. And the US has been keen, has been very strong in asking for it to be phased out. The Indian government has had questions about it. And I think we as a group have learned to be able to discuss what is our level of discomfort? Where is it that we come from? The fact that we in India would like to phase out HFC, but we do not want a chemical substitute which further puts us on a chemical treadmill. How do we move out of it? Those were all issues that we have discussed openly, and I think with a great level of confidence in each other. And we have come together to say that, yes, we will advise our governments to say that they need to be technology agnostic about it, which means that instead of saying that we'll move from one chemical to another chemical, we are agreeing to say that we need to be able to find alternatives which will be good for climate change, good for ozone, and perhaps also our products which don't lead the world into another chemical treadmill. So I think that's a great step ahead for all of us. Clearly, the issue that Mary talked about is very important. For us in Delhi, it's very important. The air is foul. We are fighting it. We are trying to get the air cleaned. Learning from the California experience of what's happened is very important. What can be done is very important. But it also, I think, where we all get enjoined is to understand that there are limits to what Delhi can do and what California can do unless we change the model of what we are doing. That we cannot plan a car-centric model and still aim to clean up air pollution or climate change. That we will have to make a mobility transformation so that we can push the world towards a healthy environment where your lungs are not being burned by local pollutants, and of course, we can have a climate secure world. So I think those are very important issues that we have discussed, and I hope that we will continue to learn from each other because we need to get it right. We are still not there.
Thank you, Sunita. So as I mentioned in the opening remarks, eventually, I think that our common interest is to have a global deal on climate change. I think every year, all the governments of the world meet. There's one this year in Lima. Next year, there's one in Paris. The Paris meet is being mentioned as one where we could expect and hope to expect some breakthroughs. And I'm particularly pleased that our dialogues are helping those processes, because the idea of a track 2 dialogue is to talk to track 1 in a way that can add some value. So we were also very pleased that we had some breaking news this morning that at the APEC summit, the President of the United States, Mr. Obama, and President of China have come to an agreement and have stated their own idea of what they could do on their own to help this process along on climate change. And Carol she has spent many years in this area, and she knows the issue intimately. And I will now request Carol to give us a deeper understanding of what was agreed today.
As I think everyone knows, there is a APEC and then G20 meeting that the world leaders are attending. And as a sidebar to those meetings, the president met with the premier, and they each announced commitments and actions that their countries, that China would take, that the US would take. I think it's important to note that there was a meeting earlier, I guess, a month ago, with your new Prime Minister when he traveled to the UN General Assembly meeting. He met with President Obama, and they also at that point took the opportunity to make some announcements in terms of work that could be done between India and the U.S. on the issues of climate change. And so what I think we see around the world is countries coming forward, looking at the realities of their own situation, looking at their history, looking at what are the tools available, and finding within their individual countries what steps they can continue to take to build on what has been done heretofore. I think the second part of that is how do countries work together, whether that's in a bilateral, which is what we saw announced earlier today, or in a multilateral form, such as the meetings that will follow on in Lima and then ultimately in Paris. I'm not going to get into all the details. They're available to you. There's numbers, there's timelines, all those things that are part of how we measure progress on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I will say from the U.S. perspective, and I had the opportunity to work with President Obama when he began his term and his efforts to make measurable reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. We worked with Mary Nichols and her governor of the state of California to achieve the first ever measurable requirements, enforceable requirements on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from cars and trucks. And now President Obama's team is looking at how to do that from power plants. This is significant, it is important, but I think Sunita, I think said it well when she said, there's still more to be done. And that's really, I think, where we are the most useful as a track to dialogue, which is to continue to look at what our government, we're not part of government, most of us were once part of government. Or never, but we continue to prod our governments. But we should also always, it's important to take time to understand when progress is being made. And as I said, I think there was important dialogue and agreements when your prime minister visited the U.S. And today, some more important progress in news between China and the U.S. And so it is, I think, important. Yeah. And it's important that these kind of dialogues continue even as that work is being done on a government-to-government basis. One of the things, I just say in closing, one of the things I had the great pleasure, I've served two presidents, to serve President Clinton and his cabinet for all 8 years of his term in office. And and got to be a part of using laws and science to set really tough air pollution standards, the first ever fine particle standard. And what I learned, and sometimes you have to remind yourself over and over again, it takes all of us. It is not just about the government doing something. It is not just about the activists, and I consider myself an activist. It's not just about industry. It's everybody figuring out the best that they can do to continue the progress.
Yes. And as you all know very well, our Prime Minister has, on more than one occasion, talked about his ambition on climate change, and he lived it when he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat, where Gujarat has become one of the few states in India which are in that sense power surplus and able to sell power to other states, and done it on the back of large amounts of renewable energy, so both solar and wind. And the government have announced very ambitious targets for improvement, for increase in renewable energy. And my suspicion is that now that this has been announced between China and the U.S., it will spur us to do more than what we have already contemplated doing. And I think that it is rather important for us to see this not just as a deal between the U.S. and China, but something that can be inspirational for the whole world. And I think we would also look at it from that point of view. So I'm sure that there are other perspectives on this. And Sunita, would you like to start with that first?
I can, but I mean, why doesn't Mary? Would you like to? I mean, okay, let me. I mean, well, you and I don't actually need to be.
We seem to be bracketing.
Well, we're not coy women. So no, I think as the nature of climate change is a contentious issue, and I think I've come to appreciate how the U.S. it is difficult to take steps, and I think in that respect, what has happened with China can be seen as an important step. The trouble with the numbers is, when you put the numbers together, is that the principle of what is coming out of the US-China agreement today is that it will not be ambitious enough, it will not be effective enough. In fact, the principle of it could even be very bad for the entire world. And the reason is very simple, that if you look at it, what the world in 1992 and beyond had agreed was climate change is real, climate change is urgent, the world needs to reduce emissions. And that already the world has actually got to high emissions, we all need to reduce. And the deal actually was that the already rich would reduce and the poorer world would develop differently with money and technology. But the agreement in 1992 was that we have already reaching the planetary limits. Now, the agreement with US and China that has been signed is actually an agreement which is perversely equitable, but it is therefore very bad for the world, because the agreement now is that US and China will converge in emissions on a per capita terms in 2030. So instead of reduction, we are talking about convergence. We are talking now in 2030, the US and China will both be at about 10 to 12 tons per capita per year. So instead of reduction, we are talking about countries like China and the US converging at 10 to 12 tons. Now, what this means for climate change, as you can well imagine, is disastrous. Because if India was to agree to say we will also converge at 10 to 12 tons, there is absolutely no space. If we talk about Africa now agreeing that the principle is convergence with the United States and not contraction, because that is where the planetary boundary is, then clearly it will not be something that will be good for us. And I think that needs to be put on the table. We need to discuss it, because if you look at what will be then agreed to in Paris would be that the EU is talking about contraction. In 2030, they will be about 4 to 5 tons. But the US and China will converge. And therefore, India today has the option that even at business as usual, and business as usual, we are talking at 2030 to be 4 tons. We should then, our perverse incentive would be to say, we need to emit more to reach 11 tons, because that's where convergence is. That's not acceptable. That's not good for the world. We cannot afford a deal which allows the threshold of 2 degrees to be breached in such a way. We need the world to stay within 2 degrees centigrade, right? Which means that we cannot afford a deal which allows for convergence with the biggest polluters. We need a contraction for all, limits for all to live within the planetary boundaries. So in that respect, this deal, unfortunately, is neither ambitious enough, nor effective, nor equitous. And we should all ask for more from our leaders. We deserve more.
Arun? Well, I think, let's just say that this is a fairly historic day. And I'm really proud that our president actually had a deal with the Chinese premier. And I think it sort of stands on its own. And we should celebrate that. And I think what moves forward and how India should react to that, let's just say that I learned a lot today. And what India is doing in terms of renewable energy and the goals it has internally on renewable energy and energy efficiency, I mean, I think if you put that as a package, it's a tremendous package. Absolutely. And I think India should be very proud Absolutely. Of that, what they're doing internally. I think whether India should get into an agreement or not, that India should decide. And what the time frame has to be, that India should decide. But I think let's just celebrate today. Let us take stock of what India is doing. And it ought to be very, very proud of itself. And let's let India plan out in terms of how to partner, who to partner, what kind of agreement, And that is an internal process, and I leave it to India to decide.
I'm not part of the government, not part of Delhi. So,
You're wearing my shawl. I'm not taking back from you.
No, if this was in Bangalore, we would have, I was telling her, we would have filled it with school kids. The question is because people wouldn't have come anyway. So the question is, I'm glad, I mean, no, the issue, what I'm saying that if India, from an India perspective, I mean, if I bridge both, what's happening here is India can actually make, today we are only talking of environmental sustainability, but there's a big component of social sustainability that mixes environmental sustainability. Absolutely. And I think we need to look at both. And if you look at both, we have to get away from the whole concept of consumptive business models to asset building business models. And how do you, and I think India is in the right place to create those type of models which blends environmental and social sustainability, which actually then proves that whatever needs you have today in terms of energy and requirements and value, more than energy, the value that you're programmed that for, and a kid is able to study under better light conditions, or people are able to work with better sewing machines or solar-powered sewing machines, you can actually have business models without actually looking at 10 tons. You can actually do it at 4 tons. So can't we place ourselves as leaders to show how it can be done at 4? And I think that's the solution-oriented. I would actually take a position that India is in that position to prove that that quality of life, I think that other quality of life is very unsustainable, but the quality of life, it blends both environmental and social sustainability, can be done at that 3 to 4 tons, which then proves, because Africa is 5 steps behind, Latin America is 3 steps behind, Southeast Asia is 2 steps behind, can't India be that center of knowledge and of solutions which then can be replicated as the Prime Minister says made in India, but I would go ahead and say thought in India and replicated from India would actually put India in a much better position of power of solutions. I mean, that's the position I would actually take.
Mary?
I agree. In California, we have brought our emissions down to the 10 level, and our goal ultimately is to get to the 4. We are a very energy efficient state. We're also blessed with sun and wind and opportunities to use alternative energy, but we're very highly dependent on transport. And we use a tremendous amount of petroleum moving ourselves around. So we face a challenge in replacing our current ways of doing things with more efficient ways. We also recognize that if we're to aspire to be a model for others, which is our intention, we want to present a model as the 8th largest economy in the world of a place that can be economically successful while also reducing its dependence on greenhouse gases and using every ounce of energy as efficiently as possible, no waste, everything used, that we need to partner with other places in the world that are in the process of growing. India is a tremendous opportunity for us to both learn and hopefully to be useful, because it is so fast growing. It has such riches in terms of population with ambitions and high standards of education and interest in these issues. It's with the government taking on some very ambitious goals. I think it's possible for us to really think in big terms about how to develop viable economies that are not emitting at the levels that they do today. And so that should be our joint goal, is to figure out how to do that.
Thank you, Mary. So, we have many members also of our group here with us today. So, if we wish, we can always direct them to share their thoughts also. But at this time, we're happy to open the dialogue with you. Please give us your name and affiliation, and try and keep your comment or question as brief as possible so that we can get as many comments as questions as possible within our allotted time till 4 p.m. So
change the climate in the room.
It's too cold.
Control and you can become sick,
Yeah,
literally.
took it away.
we will try. Who would like to ask the first question? Yes, there at the back.
Swiss.
No, it's German.
My name's Anupam Khanna. I'm the head of policy. I've just stepped down as head of policy for NASSCOM, which is the association of the IT industry in India. Service, all this. A question, I have two parts to my question. You're focused on the cooperation and trying to understand each other's position and perhaps with a view to having a deal. That's one part. The second, and I have a specific question for Ms. Browner and for Sunita on that. The second part is the more important one, which is that what is actually the mode of cooperation and who is doing what and how to actually reach this goal of, let's say, 4 or 5. I've been talking to people in the US, I mean, including at Prickard Center with Jim Sweeney and others, and how something can be done to help. I have been lost. I've been trying to find out I live in Delhi. I can't see any concrete measure on which people are actually working towards it in tangible ways. So if you know anything, please tell me. The first part of the question, Ms. Browner, and to Sunita, I think overall on a global scale, the deal today is, almost all the scenarios, it was a positive development. Most of us were feeling that would not, we knew a deal was going to be struck between China and the US, but in terms of what was done is as good as I think it was possible. But then the question is, with the change in Congress, I'm not sure that this will hold. And to Sunita, so Ms. Browner, if you would like to say that this disabuse me, that'll be good.
Consider it done.
Sunita, let's take our whole tactic up to now has been to somehow, on the one hand, try to grab on, anchor to some Chinese support.
Yeah.
And then, but we have not come up with a plan B, even though for 2 years we know that in the end there will be a deal and it was expected this year.
Thank you for joining us and thank you for your question. I think as Arun said, this is historic, this agreement and the commitments that have been made. They are not, they are in different forms and they recognize the history and the realities of the individual countries. And I applaud President Obama for his commitment and leadership. Yes, we do have a change in our Congress. Our Senate, having been the same party as the president, a Democratic Party, will now become a Republican Party. We recently had elections. The authorities, the legal authorities that the president will be relying on in terms of delivering measurable reductions, and in terms of the reductions he's already achieving, our economy's already achieving, are embedded in current law. They do not require a change in our legal structure. Our Supreme Court has upheld generally the concept that there is existing authority, legal authority to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that's the authority the president will be working under. Having said that, it doesn't mean that there won't be challenges to the individual requirements. For example, the requirements that power plants reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, or there won't be an effort in Congress to try and pass a law prohibiting what the president is attempting to do. I think the White House has been quite clear that they will fight those kind of efforts. Under our form of government, a president can veto a new law, at which point the Congress has to override the veto. And as things currently stand, it would require not only that all of the Republicans vote against the president, which we could assume they probably would, but that some number of Democrats join in that vote against the president. And so I think that while this will be a subject of much debate in our country, I think that the president is on quite strong legal grounds without a doubt, and I think on the moral and ethical grounds as well. He has been very committed throughout his career to finding ways to reduce dangerous greenhouse gas pollutants, and today is another step in that process, an important one.
Yes, it's true. India and China, Brazil, South Africa, form the basic group. And India and China have stuck together largely because there's always been the sense of, staying with China means that we get a better negotiating, bargaining power, which is possibly what we did. But if you look at today's deal and you look at our interpretation of it, now it could be wrong, but our number crunching that we have done of the deal and what it actually means. Actually, China has got for the developing world a really equitous deal. It's got a great deal for the rest of the world. China has essentially got a deal to say that we will peak in our emissions at a level which will equal your emissions. Now, if that is the deal that China has managed to secure for itself, it can well argue that it is secured on behalf of the rest of the developing world, which then means that everyone in the developing world can argue that we all have the right to reach where China and the US are, either on a per capita basis or on a total emissions. That will be open to negotiation. Both are deadly. Both numbers are really very high. 12 tons per capita is something that the world cannot support under any circumstances. So I think that could be very well argued and could be very well seen as really China has served the developing country very well by getting for it a deal which is good for China, good for India, good for Africa, bad for the planet. And I think that's really where the question for all of us have to be. We know climate change and economic growth are very deeply linked. We know we are all trying to de-link that. How fast can we do that? How fast can we decouple? That's always been the question. And I think that should be, again, the question when we get to Paris.
Can I respond to the question?
That's what I was also going to request you to.
Right at the beginning.
Yes, and also maybe you could mention a little bit on ARPA-E, what it was trying to achieve.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So let me first say that in the partnership area, you asked, are we doing anything concrete? Yes, we are. So in the first term of the Obama administration, in fact, David Sandler, my former colleague, is right here. He was instrumental in creating, with the Indian counterparts, to creating something called PACE-R, Partnership to Advance Clean Energy, and PACE-D, which is the deployment side. And under PACE-R, we have now 3 teams that are going. These are joint teams that came together on their own. They were not told to come together. They came together on their own to work on building energy efficiency, to work on solar, and for biofuels. And this is ongoing right now. And it's in the second year, if I remember correctly, right? Second or third year. And it's a 5-year thing. Under PACE-D, which is for the deployment side, the question is, can we create the policy frameworks within India, not just in the central government, but in the states, to take some of these technologies, the innovations that are happening, and bring them to scale and actually deploy them. So this is ongoing. Could we do better? Absolutely, we could do more. Could we do more in this? Sure, we can. And we should be looking at that. So now the question is, what was ARPA-E? So ARPA-E is an organization which is sort of the analog of what DARPA was, created in 1958 for the energy sector. And it is for breakthrough technologies. Because as I said, business as usual is not going to get us there, to get to the world that Sunita is talking about. So you need innovations and you need breakthroughs, not just incremental improvement. You do need incremental improvement, but you also need the breakthroughs, because today's technologies are not going to get us there. And for breakthroughs, you need science and engineering research. So if you have today's lithium-ion batteries, which are wonderful, could we do better? Is there something which will make the lithium-ion batteries obsolete? Just like lithium-ion batteries made nickel metal hydride batteries and hopefully lead-acid batteries obsolete. And that's the innovation that ARPA-E has created. Just like DARPA. When I went to Washington, the first thing people said that, oh, DARPA created the internet, it created GPS, no pressure on you, what are you going to do? And we said, well, we'll take a shot. We'll take shots at the goal. And not all of them will be successful. We'll fail in most of them, which is fine. That's what research is all about. But in a few of them, that could be game-changing, not just for the United States, but for the whole world. That's what RPU is all about.
So just to make the link maybe a little bit clearer, the announcement made by China about their goal and willingness to cap their emissions, which they've said they'll try to do better, opens up China to investment by international businesses that have very advanced technologies that they wish to promote in a way that probably wouldn't have happened without that agreement being made. That, to me, is one of the major points of an announcement like that. I don't know whether that's a deal that would hold in the international arena. I'm not an international negotiator either. I agree that we certainly need much more if we're to reach a sustainable planet. So I hope we don't stop there. But the fact that they were willing to make that commitment, or at least that the president on behalf of the nation is willing to make that commitment, to me is historic in the sense that it means that the kinds of negotiations or discussions that we, California, have been having with Chinese states and cities and provinces around their energy systems, their transportation systems, are going to lead to something real happening. And I think the important connection here with what Arun was doing is that this is, we have to actually deliver the emissions reductions. We have to actually demonstrate the growth that happens without all the pollution. And this is opening the way for that.
You know, Harish, you've always talked about more efficient sewing machines, more efficient fans, more efficient everything. Maybe you'll want to talk about the technology impact that you know would be useful for people who are at the lowest level of consumption in India, which is the vast majority, and that's what will bring about the 4 tons and not the 10 tons.
Right. No, I'll take it from his question of India. See, it's always good if 2 countries make agreement before we do an agreement. We can actually always do a better agreement. Is that because what I saw in the agreement was it was an exclusive agreement. If we do an agreement, it becomes an inclusive agreement as far as the world is concerned. So when we sign an agreement, it should be where the world believes that this is an agreement for all of us rather than it's between India and the US agreement. And that's related to the energy efficiency point is because as we go deeper into the economic strata of our own country and as it maps out to any other 2.5 billion people in the world, it's as if you break the poor into 3 segments, poor, very poor, and abject poverty. And if you look at people who are at very poor and abject poverty, there has to be linkages to anything that we do to income generation. And today, there's a wonderful linkage between sustainable energy and income generation. But today, what's happened is interestingly, this is an example I keep telling here, is for example, a sewing machine. Today, when you design solar for a sewing machine, and for a sari and a blouse, you need 30 watts. The minimum available sewing machine is 110 watts. So the blame goes on solar energy to be expensive. Nobody says that the sewing machine is inefficient, right? Now we need to create, if people in abject poverty and poor, very poor, have to come out of it, you need to have high-efficient sewing machines, silk weaving machines, basket-making machines, soldering irons. It's a whole different where we've done a lot of innovation from incandescent lights to LEDs because that crosses boundaries. Sewing machine doesn't cross boundaries. Silk weaving machine doesn't cross boundaries. That's where the niche of India is, where you can actually, where the paradox of an overdeveloped India and an underdeveloped India can actually create that sense of innovation. And that's where where we have this collaboration that makes sense, make high efficient products with fantastic financial products that matches the cash flow of a street vendor versus a farmer with the business enterprises, create those processes, make those processes open source for Africans and Latin Americans to actually replicate. And that's the deal we should have, where when we sign the deal with America, Africans should feel that's the deal we want, not the one that the US and the Chinese actually want.
Yes.
Thank you, David. My name is Kishan Kal.
Microphone.
Thank you. My name is Kishan Kalra. I'm a trustee of the Climate Project Foundation, which is the independent India chapter of the movement started by Al Gore. I have 2 questions, if you will permit. First is a simple query from Mary as to what happened to the 6,000 odd wind turbines that you had in California at the Altamont Pass I saw them some maybe 20 years ago, 25 years ago sometime, which were each generating 100 kilowatts of wind energy. I believe they were all dismantled. I don't know why it was done and whether they've been replaced by more efficient wind turbines, bigger wind capacity wind turbines or not. My second question, the main question arises from the comment that Sunita made about this convergence arising out of the agreement today between China and USA and how it can be disastrous for the planet. I agree with her that at 12 tons per capita, if the global average that becomes, it will be totally disastrous for the planet. But unless we find some equitable, some parity between a developed country like America and a developing country like India, where we are less than 4 tons, and where there is great need to take up industrialization, great need to increase our emissions also, which will go along with the industrialization. So unless there's an agreement to come a meeting ground, what kind of cooperation are we really talking about between US and India? I mean, US should also agree to come down to maybe 6 tons or something like that, and permit India to also go to 6 tons. And the technologies which are being developed in the US, fantastic technologies, but can India really afford them? Unless America would agree to give us those technologies at an affordable cost and price, then only there can be meeting ground, then only there can be cooperation. Thank you.
Well, with respect to renewable energy, we have on the books a requirement that all of the electricity that is actually delivered into California has to be 33% renewable energy by 2020, and that excludes both large hydro and nuclear. So 33% of all the electricity being purchased in California, being delivered into California, wherever it comes from, has to be solar or wind or geothermal. And as of today, we're at around, depending on which utility, which part of the state you're in, somewhere between 20 and 25. We're well on track to make that 2020 goal. What happened with wind is an illustrative story, I think, about cost being a factor in all of this, because initially when the law was first passed, people thought it was going to be wind and large-scale solar. Meantime, the cost of solar panels has fallen drastically. And so decentralized, distributed solar has really taken up a huge portion of that renewable energy, somewhat to the consternation of the big central utilities, because it's harder for them to deal with. But it's very good for consumers, and it's also very good for the environment. So we are excited about the potential here, and we realize that other forms of distributed generation are also beginning to pop up, including small-scale wind as well. So setting an ambitious target and then allowing for some neutrality about the technology that would be used to meet it is a policy strategy that we think is a good one and that we would recommend.
No, I think Mr. Kaldra's point was very, nothing to add.
So there are many ladies in the audience. I would like to recognize as many of them as possible. Yes, please.
My name is Klaus Voll. I wanted to ask, where do you see role models and capabilities for innovative technologies in Europe, for instance, not to be confined to the US-India dialogue, in practical terms?
In Europe.
I think let's get a few more questions,
Yeah,
and then maybe
okay.
we can answer.
Can we get
together.
some mic here?
Two ladies.
But it'd be easier for everyone to hear. We might hear you. There's a mic right there.
Yeah. Thanks. You know,
Give your name.
oh, sorry. My name is Urmi Goswami. I'm with the Economic Times. And my question is about really the US-China agreement. I'm just interested in seeing, how do you see it playing out with the negotiations? I mean, I know there's this whole way of looking at it, whether it's ambitious, unambitious. You may look at it as saying it's a start and so on and so forth. But how does it play out? And for Sunita, very specifically, how do you see it in terms of the Indian position? How does it impact the way we negotiate as ourselves and also as part of the larger developing country bloc? Thank you.
Carol, why don't you begin, and then I can answer the specific
I am not an international negotiator by any stretch of the imagination. I am a former regulator. I understand setting health-based pollution standards and then creating that create market opportunities and new solutions. To the gentleman who asked about Europe, I think there's a very interesting case in Europe, in Germany, where they have made a decision to move out of one type of energy, and it is having some probably consequences they had hoped for, some that they hadn't hoped for, but in terms of their renewables, those are growing, and and I think that's in direct response to a government action. But as I think it is, as I said, I'm not an international negotiator. How this agreement, this bilateral agreement, will have consequences into Lima and then on into Paris, I leave to people who are well versed in international negotiations. I do not claim to be.
Urmi, I'm not an international negotiator either, but I am willing to give you an opinion. Okay.
I can't even go that far.
No problem. I'm giving you very clearly what I think would happen. Let's be very clear. The international agreement right now has essentially, as of the last few years, countries have agreed to a pledge and review system. And in some senses, what has happened between the US and China now is not unexpected. It has been very clear that all countries will be required to put on the table what is known as the intended national, domestic national, no, whatever. Huh? INDCs, okay? And it has been agreed that that would happen by March. Now, the only thing is the timing of it. It's been done before March, but it was not unexpected. Numbers are on the table. The point is that where would India be in this? It is broadly agreed that all countries will agree to 10 to 15% enhancement. So China has basically put a number on the table, but it has said it will peak, which is a big number in itself. But it has said that it has restated its renewable energy target, which is rather ambitious as well. Put that on the table. The US has now said from 17% over 2005 to 26 to 28% over 2005. Obviously, India will need to put its own number on the table and, whatever it is. But the fact is, that's not the end of the negotiations. That's the beginning of the negotiations. Because what all countries have also agreed is that they will then look at all these numbers that are put together in terms of how they aggregate, the sum of those numbers measure up to what the world needs to be if it wants to avoid 2 degrees centigrade rise. And that is really where the negotiations start in March and are expected to conclude by Paris. And now that is where the question has been, when you look at what the numbers are put on the table, you look at the gap between what the numbers are and where we need to be, how will you determine the contributions or the commitments by countries? And that is where the issue of equity comes in. The African group has put a proposal of an equity reference framework on the table. The Indian group has not put a counter proposal or its own proposal of how it would like to see the numbers. So I think the negotiations are not over. I think it is good that the US and China have indicated what their numbers will be. And I think it's important for all of us now to work together to get the kind of integrity we need so that we can avoid that catastrophe which is above 2 degrees centigrade.
So Arun, would you like to take on?
Yeah, on the European side, as you correctly pointed out, the world is not just US and India. There are other countries involved. Many of the technologies that we're talking about, whether it's solar or batteries, whatever that may be, these are all global supply chains. And some nations are good at something, some nations are good at other things. And I think in the Europe case, I mean, you've got a large, and the other thing I would just want to point out is that we have been in the government and we represent the country. Most of the scaling is done by the private sector, done by the industry. And the industry is a competitive global market. And some nations excel in something, other nations excel in other things. So I think Europe is playing in that global marketplace. And it has done well in certain things, and China has done well in others, US has done well in others, and so on and so forth. So I don't think this is a US, India, or Europe, and it's just a global issue. Yes, please.
I'm Harpreet, and representing a trust called SOCH, which is then another name for a thought process. I think we need to start from science and then go to individual impacts to think global. Because atmosphere is common to all, and energy is constant to all. And if we think about the good energies, which have been converted now, and the bad, try to have something out of good linked to the bad. Said that, my question to anyone from the panelists, whoever considers it appropriate, is, are we thinking about any global policies beyond US-China, India-US, India-China, Europe-US, beyond? Because atmosphere at the end is going to affect all in a similar way, more or less. And it is going to be through the nature. So no policy, no developing is going to help us. So do we have something in mind related to global policies wherein humankind is going to be secured? One. Two, do we really have, as Mr. Arun has just pointed out, you had RPEs, such an organization wherein breakthrough technologies are worked out. Do we have something wherein we are working for a source of energy which is going to be utilized by all, again, at a global perspective or with a global perspective, and we will have the development, the industrialization, and the revolution. I don't know if exactly the color is green or it has no color. But do we really have those policies in place, or are we intended to have those policies which are going to be global and going to take care of the atmosphere at large? Thank you.
So we have a question right here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Kriti Trehan, and I'm a policy professional in tariffs, and it seems to be working decently well. But in India, I don't see something like that happening really at a larger scale. I was wondering if the panel had any thoughts on how to make the concept of feed-in tariffs, say, more incentivized, more lucrative for businesses to utilize that concept, in effect making us more sustainable in terms of energy consumption.
I can take that as well.
Yeah, we'll take a couple more questions and then
I'm Anu Bose. I'm a senior advocate, Supreme Court, and a special advisor to Tata Consultancy Services. And something that would be interest to Mary, I'm a close associate of Jim Strzok. He's one of the top environment lawyers of America, and he used to be the chairman of the California Environment Protection and the energy secretary when Pete Wilson was the governor. Be that as it may, many years ago, madam, our great philosopher, President Radhakrishnan, when he landed in America, was received by President Kennedy, and the weather was foul, it was raining heavily. And Kennedy looks up at the sky and then apologized to our president for the foul weather. And then our great president looked up at the sky as well and said, Mr. President, we cannot change the weather, but we can change the course of the weather. Wow. In that context, how would these two great foul weather friends, India and the United States, cooperate in making the world a better place to live in? Thank you.
Would you give the mic to the gentleman next to you also?
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Krishnbir Chaudhary, President, Indian Farmers Organization in Bharatiya Krishak Samaj. I have one question only relating to agriculture sector. We use the chemical science model, and yes, we accept that it affects the air pollution as well as the water pollution. And now we are getting the too much pressure that we should go ahead the genetically modified crops, which are more dangerous for environment, which needs more energy. We have an example of Maharashtra, because there are no water available due to shortage of electricity, and the total crop was damaged, farmer committing suicides. Why? On what grounds? On humanitarian grounds? why the US people are not looking after the dangerous, most dangerous for human health as well as for environment. This is my question, relating to human health as well as environment also, for both. Please, for US friends also, we request that please this type of technology should be stopped with immediate effect. Thank you.
Okay, where should we start?
We're going to be we'll go back to feed-in tariffs.
Feed-in tariff, Carol.
Yes.
Sorry.
Well, I can say something about feed-in tariffs. The feed-in tariff is a tool by which you create an incentive for people to bid in whatever you're looking for and basically guarantee a price for it. That's what it is. So you can adjust the amount that's available to incentivize at a higher level. The criticism of it is that it can be very expensive because, by definition, you're paying whatever you've set up front, even if the cost could be lower. But it's a way of getting industry to respond quickly because you put out the money there as an inducement. So I think it's a very useful tool, and it is being employed in a number of places. I guess Germany is really the pioneer in this for renewables. But on a smaller scale, my own home city of Los Angeles adopted a feed-in tariff for solar last year. And it has a really wonderful effect on local developers of solar because they see that the market is there, and it creates an atmosphere where people who are building buildings, people who are looking at investing in the community understand that this is now public policy, and so they respond to it as well. So I think it is a great tool. It's not the only way you can create incentives, but it's a good one.
Yep.
As you know, India has a feed-in tariff. And in fact, it's been the way that we have built our solar transition in India. And I think we had a very, very intelligent feed-in tariff because there are two ways of really doing funding. At least in India, we used to do it funding based on capital. So we used to give a subsidy to developers, which was how we built our first generation of wind power. When we started our solar mission and we decided to ramp up solar, we decided to come up with a feed-in tariff approach, a generation-based incentive approach. But we also realized that unlike Germany, where our consumers don't have the money to be able to pay the differential. So what government did was to come up with a very interesting bundling scheme in which you bundled dirty energy with 1 unit of clean energy, and you essentially found the money to be able to pay for the differential between what would be the cost to generate and what the utility could pay. And that is how the first 500 megawatt of solar was built in India. That's how the second time when the bid came out, we went from 16 rupees down to 9 rupees because already you had ramped up the solar, and therefore the costs came down. So India has had it, and I think India needs to do a lot more. I mean, in my view, what we need is a really inventive policy so that we can use every rooftop as a solar plant. We can make sure that we can do that with a differential tariff. We should do that with mini grids. I mean, we have an incredible opportunity of saying, here are a large number of people who are not connected to the grid today. It's completely unacceptable for all of us as Indians that so many millions of Indians live without electricity. But instead of first taking them through the fossil route, let's leapfrog them to clean energy. Let's do that with mini grids. Let's find that differential tariff. So in fact, my organization, CSC, is today proposing what we are calling a global feed-in tariff regime. We're saying, let's come up with an agreement globally that we will pay the differential between what would be the cost of generating solar in a mini grid. Because we want this to be combined with the objective of energy access. Okay? So we are saying it's not about solar, it's about energy access. And you pay the differential and you pay it globally. So you actually come up with an inventive tool on it. And I think that's why, Mr. Bose, your story on the foul weather friends can actually come together. Because if we are enjoined with the common objective of being able to decouple our economies and find deep ways of being able to do things differently, then we have the opportunity, as I keep saying, we haven't still motorized. We can first take the bus without first having to take the car first. But Marys can get into the bus. And so we can be together on it. So we have huge opportunities of doing it. We just need to make our governments understand that we've run out of time, we've run out of space. We need hard action, deep action. GMOs, I will leave to you.
Well, but I think that food and water are as an important a part of the discussion about climate change as energy. First of all, growing our food, making water clean, making water available, all takes energy. And we have been very focused in the Track 2 dialogue on the energy production side. We did find ourselves yesterday broadening out the discussion and talking about water, not so much about food, and so we thank you for raising that. But ultimately, to your earlier point, the question is about broad-scale environmental sustainability, which is really economic sustainability, and all of this does, come together. I wanted to make a comment on the role of governments, because as different as governments can feel, and we have different systems, you have a parliamentary system, we don't, their tools are not dissimilar. And one of the great things that governments can do, and sometimes to good end, and sometimes perhaps not to good end, is to create market certainty, to create the mechanism that brings the private sector dollars in, whether that's in the form by providing tax credits, by the regulatory regime. In the U.S., it is, I think, fair to say that our renewable industry has in part, or in large part, was able to get a strong foothold because of two actions that the government took. One at the national level, which is we have tax breaks. So we were able to drive down the cost for the renewable project developers and make it more competitive with our traditional energy supplies. But secondly, because states, California being one example, but there are 25 other states, adopted a renewable requirement, said it's X percentage.
Absolutely.
And so, I think one of the responsibilities for all of us is to look at how to best use the tools of government to achieve these kind of sustainable outcomes and to recognize the similarity in terms of the tools that are available.
Yeah, I wanted to actually first go to the the question that, the Europeans are also very critical in the way the bilateral funding happens, India, Africa, and Latin America. I think we need, and there you can have all the policies. Sometimes the bilateral funding can actually spoil the potential of creating different processes or make it happen. And that's where I think Europeans can actually play a much larger role, because they are very critical in many of the African states, and it's the European funding in the bilateral way that actually defines their policies. I think that's so critical for having Europe on the table and if I look at especially the Dutch model of investment is what the energy sector needs. Long-term exit strategies of 15, 20 years. And how the Dutch, and for example, simple, I don't know if you can Google Dutch lottery, it's a very unique way the lottery system works, in which 90% of the profits actually go into the investment space, the Dutch postcode lottery. So I think those are, we can definitely learn. Regarding the feed-in tariff, I have a little bit different, because first of all, personal opinion, I don't believe in large solar. And it's the same as large anything in many ways. Okay, and it's the same, you're going to have a resource crunch on land as well as in water for cleaning. So and then plus you transmit it through 32% transmission distribution losses, nobody actually calculates, except in cases of feed-in tariff, like I think Jamshed should mention the plans that he has put on his own 2 factories, and that is what actually makes sense. But individual houses, let's not copy what Germany has done and California has done blindly, because in Germany and California, people work in the cities and live in the suburbs. Okay, and you always have the security that the next guy neighbor is not going to build a 3-star or a 4-star. Here in Delhi and our metro cities, we are going vertical. I put up a solar plant, tomorrow I don't know, the next land is going to get sold, it's going to forward, and my shadow on this actually completes. So we need to be very careful about how do we look at feed-in tariffs. But in second-grade cities or individuals, And how do you look at microgrids in the other part is what is making. And why don't we look generation based? I mean, let's have a meter in the house. Forget feeding it back to the electricity. Why don't we give incentives to people how much they're using at home itself? It makes economical value rather than looking at how do we feed it back, feed it back, feed it back. Let's design it for our own households. Like solar water heaters in Karnataka, you have a delta incentive for solar water heaters from your electricity bill. That actually pushed a lot of the water heating actually companies to happen. And to your question, I think we should go back to what John Lennon imagine no countries. Until that happens.
No, but the point you make is while the goals may be the same, the solution path has to necessarily be modeled on the realities
of what it is
on the ground, which is the history that's brought us to where we are, the needs of the people real time. I mean, you know, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer.
No, like solar. People think solar water pump, solar water pump, solar water pump. I'll tell you, 6 of the 10 solar water pumps there are, though, people have no respect for water because they, oh, solar is free. Put it in the morning, 6 o'clock. Come back at 6 o'clock in the evening. The water is flowing happily, right? It has to be a combination of solar and drip irrigation, efficiency of water, and all it needs to be holistic. And that's where I come back to the point, India is that center of innovation for the world to learn from.
Well, where we don't.
I guess, well, all the easy questions have been answered, than the GMO one. Well, let me say a little bit. I think I'm a beneficiary, having grown up in India, and I think many of the people out here, of the first green revolution of Norman Borlaug, which was a fantastic US-India partnership. Mm-hmm. And the question is there a second green revolution without the ill effects that you were saying? And I completely agree with you. And from what I know of biology, I think we are living in the golden age of biology. And most of that has been focused on human health. And rightly so. But the question is, can that be leveraged in some way to look at agricultural side? And one of the things we did in ARPA-E was do exactly that. Is that could we, I mean, food is based on photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is one of the most inefficient mechanisms to capture sunlight and fix carbon dioxide to make things, whether it's food or something else. And the question we asked was, could we tinker with photosynthesis to increase the efficiency so that for a given land and given water, you can increase the productivity of food without the ill effects? And frankly, there are scientists and engineers in the labs which are trying exactly that. Could we make plants drought resistant? And drought resistant has to do with some of the biology in the leaves. And could we do that? And the answer is possibly. But you've got to do the research to be able to say that. So I would say the ill effects of GMO, I totally agree with you, but that should not stop us from doing the research to find solutions using the science that could actually enhance and give you the productivity to create the second green revolution and benefit the other billions that are yet to be born, like we got the benefit of the first green revolution.
So we have 10 minutes left, so yes, lady at the back and then here.
My name is Bahar Dutt, author and independent journalist. My question is regarding the, I know there is a problem about the economics of renewable energy, but is there also a problem about the perception around renewable energy? And that is, I'll give you an example of Bihar, where Has Power, it's a company which deals with renewables, they managed to light up a couple of villages. And when the chief minister went there to inaugurate, one village which had got electricity through a renewable source, they said, this is fine, but when will we have real energy? And for them, the real energy was coal-based energy. So is there a perception that renewables is only for the poor? And how do we look at maybe the rich switching to renewables?
Yeah.
It's the opposite.
We have the
US.
opposite issue in the States.
Or in the States, are the hippies seen as more prone to renewables? I don't know.
No, I mean, there's a real issue about equity in allowing or making it possible for poor people, that is, poor people who don't own their own homes, to have access to solar. Because if you don't own your own roof, you can't put a solar panel on the roof, and the landlord has no incentive to put a solar panel on the roof because he just passes the cost on to the tenants of the electricity. So that is an issue that we're struggling with, to try to make the renewable energy available. But when people are offered a choice, do you want cleaner energy or dirtier energy, it's really never, that I'm aware of, been an issue. In fact, it's sort of the opposite.
I think her point is because coal-based energy in India has been less expensive. So that
it's also fed through the grid. It's also fed through the grid. It's more regular. People see it, the stand post, as a sign of progress because it's reliable, supposedly reliable. The problem is it's not reliable. Right. You get an electricity pole, but you don't get electricity. Right. But there's an aspirational issue in it. And it's a right aspirational issue. And I think for all of us, I think the issue is, I mean, this is the difference between US and India. I mean, in the US, you're already connected to the grid. You already have electricity. Right. And you're now bringing in clean electricity. Right. Whereas here, we do not have electricity. Right. And the question, I think, for all of us is, and I think Harish has done an incredible job in doing this, is to make sure that you can get the poorest in the world that form of electricity, which is clean, but then also make it reliable and make it aspirational. So that, and cost effective, but aspirational as well, so that people don't see it as, I've got one panel, and therefore in the one panel, I mean, I've been to villages where people have told me, I've got one panel, and so I can run a light, but now I have a TV, and I'm not allowed to run the TV because the electricity people say, you have one panel, and if you do anything more, it's not allowed. But that's where the scaling up, the wonderful thing about renewable is you can scale up, but it will cost, and we need to understand those costs. We need to build those systems which are durable.
Can I take a leaf?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Meena.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I work for the Hindu. My question is also on the climate treaty. And one of the things that Mary Nichols raised was that the Indo-U.S. treaty today also helps China. The Indo-China-U.S. treaty today helps a lot of technology to be transferred to China. So that's a little dangerous, considering that we've all been demanding a transfer of technology, not necessarily as a business investment opportunity. So that's a bit scary about this from what you said. And secondly, I wanted to ask anyone, Sunita also in particular, if this deal really precludes the fact that in some way the US again won't be part of an international treaty. Or do you think it will be part of a global treaty by Paris next year? And will it set more ambitious targets?
May I just quickly, I think I may not have made myself clear. By setting a longer term goal, by saying that they will stabilize at 2030 or earlier, what I'm saying is that China opened up by having a reliable standard, made it more possible for people to invest. I didn't say that that meant that we were committed to give technology.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. So invest. So actually the whole idea has been to transfer the technology, which will help clean energy. So I'm a little confused about whether this deal actually means investment or transfer of technology.
Actually, in case of solar, etc., it would be transferred the other way.
Yeah, because they
are the biggest manufacturers of solar. Right. So it goes both ways.
Right. Yeah. Just on the actual numbers that were put forward by the U.S., they do note that they intend to take those numbers into the discussions. So I'm not quite sure what you mean when you say, will the U.S. be a party to the U.S. has every intention, has been participating in the lead up to Lima, and by this is indicating an intention to put numbers on the table for Paris, as other countries will be doing.
No, I agree with Carol. I think the U.S. will very much be party. In fact, the agreement is now that it will be domestic actions And that's what the US has said. US has made it clear that it cannot agree to an international agreement which has targets set by the international community, the Kyoto type. So it's not a Kyoto type agreement anymore. That was a shift in Copenhagen.
That was Copenhagen,
okay?
Right.
And from Copenhagen to now, we now have it cemented. So now it is a pledge and review system. It's domestic action. The US does not have to go to its Senate and say it's agreed to an international treaty where the targets are set. They're domestic targets set, but they are put out on the table as a nation of community, as a community of nations. All domestic targets are put out. Now, our problem as environmentalists is that if you have such an agreement, one, it doesn't measure up to what the world needs to do, and two, because it is a pledge and review system, it delinks itself from CBDR. So I think that's where our difference is, but nevertheless, it's a big move because you do get US part of an international agreement.
But I would go, what I would say is important is that it is not simply a set of numbers that were announced. No. There is a plan that sits behind that shows you how those numbers.
Question.
And it is and the plan is based on standards, regulations that are enforceable.
That's
I mean, just by way of example, last week the United States and California participated, announced the single largest penalty against a company for failing to meet environmental standards. It was against a car company for, what's the right word? Misstating their greenhouse gas emissions. So not only, I mean, I think it's no.
It was on fuel efficiency.
It was on GHGs.
Yes. Was GHG or fuel efficiency?
Both. On both. They paid it's a Kia Hyundai. They paid a $300 million fine. And I think I mentioned this because I think it is proof that the U.S. intends to enforce that's a regulation that was adopted at the beginning of the Obama administration, intends to enforce these regulations.
Very important.
So we have last question, but make it quick, please, because it's already 4 o'clock.
Okay, I'm Rita Brara, University of Delhi. I have a simple question. I just wondered how much you can disentangle the environment from climate change. You know, there seems to be a paradigm shift where everything is being framed in terms of climate change. We seem to have moved away from the idea of environment somewhat. That's one. And my second question, again, you can answer it very briefly, anyone on the panel, is we haven't spoken of vulnerability at all. And it's striking how in a session on climate change and energy, we're talking maybe about, okay, global warming's happening, we need more energy, but we haven't mentioned how we consider people vulnerable, who we consider vulnerable, whether the nation state is itself a good framework for discussing some of these issues. Anyone on the panel?
One thing I'll just note on the so you're talking about sort of the environment pollution side.
Versus climate.
Yeah, that can you talk of climate change without considering the environment? Because whenever you do, the impact is on the environment, and any measures are through the environment.
I think they are joined in many ways, many ways, and many of the things you do, a country might do, a community might do to reduce what we call conventional air pollutants, could have greenhouse gas benefits, or efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, climate change emissions would have immediate public health benefits. Interestingly, in the announcement today, they do reference air pollution benefits as part, or air pollution, I guess, what does it say? Plans to address air pollution. So they even though it is, I think, being recognized as a greenhouse gas climate change announcement, there is a reference to conventional air pollution problems.
I would just say I look at it sort of from a different perspective because I'm an environmentalist. That's my training and my activity. But as we use greenhouse gases as sort of the metric for our success, what that does is it requires us to take into account everything we're doing in the environmental arena in a much more cohesive way than we had before. So instead of just looking at the tailpipe or the smokestack, now we're also looking at the forest and what the land cover and at the kinds of pesticides that we're using and at water and how we move it around or how we clean it, because the energy that we use in that is also contributing to our sum total of greenhouse gas emissions. So actually addressing climate change forces a more holistic way of dealing with environmental issues than anything that we have ever done before.
So one thing is, I don't first agree that we should, as we say, sustainable energy is expensive for the rich and affordable to the poor. So the question is that the poor, it's expensive, we believe it's expensive. And then we force a policy, it's expensive, 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 it's actually not expensive. As you go deeper into the economic strata, the cost of energy actually increases. Today, if you actually create the right models of implementation, this is not. And in terms of perception, you go to a village, you actually put it on top of a temple, now it's good for the rich and the poor. Or go to a church, it's a way of how you perceive, how do you actually do, how do you actually create the value for individuals. So it's, again, and husk power issue is completely different. The way I read it in the newspapers and everything, or reports about husk power, actually it's not why it actually went the wrong way. That's a completely different option. So I think we should get away from the concept. How many of us in this room actually pay for charging a cell phone? None of us. We find a court, we are subsidized by what? I mean, the rich are subsidized. It's not the poor. And I think we should relook the framing up. And in terms of vulnerability, ma'am, you're absolutely right. I mean, we also very, very insensitive at saying that if a farmer commits suicide in Maharashtra, who come from the poor category, the family goes into abject poverty. To come back to poor category, it will actually take 2 more decades. There are wonderful models where sustainable energy could be that net that the family does not go back to the second level. And those are models that we can actually replicate, provided actually people move out of Delhi and see what's actually going on in India. I think that is something that would be important for all of us.
So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your participation in this panel discussion. It's been a great pleasure for all of us to interact with you, and I want to thank all the panelists, and especially our friends, Carol, and all your colleagues who've come from the US for this dialogue. And we look forward to seeing you at another time at another Ananta Center event. Thank you.